Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever watched a modern political debate or maybe just scrolled through the comments under a controversial post and felt this overwhelming sense of exhaustion? Not just because people are disagreeing. Disagreement is totally normal, but because it genuinely feels like nobody is actually communicating. Well, today we're going to explore exactly why that is. We're doing a deep dive into the fractured state of modern discourse, all based on Alasdair MacIntyre's absolute masterpiece of a book, After Virtue. We're going to break down the exact philosophical history of why modern morality is totally broken, and much more importantly, how we can actually fix it.
Starting with Part 1, The Crime Scene, a true sci-fi moral apocalypse.
Picture this. Imagine a future where an extreme anti-science movement burns all the labs and destroys all scientific knowledge. Centuries later, people try to rebuild science using only torn, surviving pages of old textbooks. They start throwing around words like neutrino or atomic weight, and it sure looks like they're doing science, right? But they have zero underlying framework. They don't actually know what any of it means. MacIntyre argues this is exactly what happened to our moral vocabulary. Take a look at a standard political debate. Person A argues that high taxes are theft and a violation of individual rights. Person B argues that taxes are absolutely required for communal justice to fix inequality. Now here's the wild part. Both sides are completely logically valid within their own bubbles, but they just bounce right off each other because they have absolutely no common ground on what human life is actually for. There's an academic term for this breakdown: conceptual incommensurability. It sounds like a mouthful, but it simply means our modern debates start from premises that have zero shared foundation. And when you have no shared foundation, any kind of rational resolution is mathematically impossible. We've completely lost the grand story that used to give these concepts their meaning. So what do we do when reason fails? We just turn up the volume. We literally just start shouting at each other. Which brings us to Part 2, the secret infection, or as it's sometimes called, the boo/hurrah theory. Because we can't solve moral debates with logic anymore, society quietly adopted a hidden philosophy to fill the void. It's called emotivism. Emotivism is the theory that moral statements are not objective facts about the universe. They're really just expressions of personal feeling. So under emotivism, when someone says murder is wrong, they aren't stating a fact. They're basically just saying boo to murder, I don't like it. And saying charity is good just means hurrah for charity. This explains so much about our culture today. It's why when someone disagrees with us, we don't assume they made a logical error in their argument. We assume they're just a bad person, and we try to manipulate, shame, or completely cancel them instead of debating them. We've turned morality into a game of raw emotional power. And emotivism actually creates some very specific characters in our society. MacIntyre points out 3 dominant modern archetypes. First, you have the rich aesthete, who lives entirely for personal pleasure and novelty. To them, the world is just one giant consumer buffet. Then you have the therapist, who doesn't care about moral truth or concepts like sin. They only care about psychological adjustment, basically making sure you function well in society. Finally, the manager, who claims to be totally neutral, only caring about maximizing efficiency and organizing resources. Notice what they all share. Not a single one of them cares about what is fundamentally good or bad. Moral truth has just been completely replaced by desire, therapy, and management. Let's move to Part 3. The suspects. We need to look at the Enlightenment's fatal flaw. So who broke the moral apparatus in the first place? To find the culprit, we really need to understand how classical morality used to work. It was essentially a 3-legged stool. Leg 1 was raw, untutored human nature. Leg 3 was the telos. That's the Greek word for your ultimate purpose or potential. And the middle leg was moral rules, which acted as the bridge to teach raw human nature how to cross over and reach its telos. Think of it like a sports car. Raw human nature is the car just sitting in the garage, and the telos is the car racing down the track at top speed. The moral rules are just the owner's manual to get it there. But during the Enlightenment, science brilliantly discarded telos for physics because obviously rocks and atoms don't have a conscious purpose. The fatal flaw was that philosophers disastrously threw it away for humans too. They kept the moral rules, the owner's manual, but completely forgot what a human being was actually supposed to do. So without a telos, the absolute geniuses of the Enlightenment tried, and totally failed, to rebuild morality. David Hume tried to base morality on passion and empathy, but let's be real, human passions are way too chaotic and contradictory. Then Immanuel Kant tried to base it on cold, hard, pure reason, but his system ended up being empty. If you're clever enough, you can rationalize almost any bad behavior. Finally, Soren Kierkegaard threw his hands up and said morality is just a radical, arbitrary choice. But think about it. If morality is just an unprovable, arbitrary choice, it's not a fact at all. It's really just emotivism all over again. Which takes us to part 4, the crossroads, the ultimate showdown. By the late 19th century, the collapse was pretty much total, which set the stage for the ultimate choice for the modern human, Friedrich Nietzsche versus Aristotle. Nietzsche saw right through the fake hypocrisy of modern culture. He flat out declared that since the Enlightenment failed, objective morality is just a myth. All that's left is the will to power, arbitrary choice, and raw force. Might makes right. And MacIntyre admits something pretty shocking here. Nietzsche was actually entirely right about the Enlightenment's failure. But Nietzsche only wins if we forget Aristotle. Aristotle represents the reconstruction of the classical tradition, the profound belief that human life does have a telos and that true fulfillment comes through virtue. Faced with this monumental choice, MacIntyre firmly chooses Aristotle. Okay, part 5, the blueprint. How we actually rebuilt this thing with 3 pillars. If we choose Aristotle, how do we practically fix our daily lives? You obviously can't just pass a law to make people virtuous. MacIntyre says we have to rebuild virtue from the ground up, and he gives us 3 interconnected pillars to do it: establishing practices, recognizing the narrative unity of human life, and anchoring in tradition. Let's break these down. To really understand the first pillar, practices, let's use a quick chess analogy. Imagine you're teaching a kid, let's call him Leo, to play chess, and you pay him in candy every time he plays. At first, he's motivated entirely by external goods, money, status, or in this case, candy. And here's the thing, if he can cheat to get that candy, he probably will. But over time, Leo might actually learn to love the strategy and the sheer beauty of the game itself. His motivation shifts. He's now playing for internal goods. And you absolutely cannot cheat to get internal goods. If you cheat at chess, you haven't mastered chess. You've just ruined the practice. Virtues are simply the necessary muscle skills, things like discipline, honesty, and courage, that are required to achieve the internal goods of any complex cooperative human practice. The second pillar is the narrative unity of human life. Modern individualism tends to treat life like a series of disconnected TikTok clips. You're an employee from 9 to 5, then a consumer at the mall, then a voter at the booth. But human beings are literally storytelling animals. Without narrative unity, life is just chaotic and meaningless. But when you view your life as a single story, your actions start to make sense. Think of Frodo Baggins on his quest to Mount Doom. His virtues of courage and loyalty aren't just random rules he's following. They are essential character decisions anchored by the third pillar, a living tradition that connects him to the past and to his community. Finally, part 6, the escape, also known as the Benedict Option. So, how do we apply this blueprint today? Can we just fix our whole hyper-capitalist emotivist system from the inside out? MacIntyre gives a resounding hard no. He actually compares our current era to the fall of the Roman Empire. When Rome was collapsing under its own bureaucratic weight and decay, the really smart people didn't stick around trying to fix the empire from the top down. Instead, figures like St. Benedict withdrew and built local, intentional monastic communities. These quiet, dedicated communities focused on real practices, deep friendships, and preserving virtue through the Dark Ages. MacIntyre argues we are called to do the exact same thing today. Not necessarily to all become monks, right? But to build local, intentional communities focused on real practices, instead of engaging in endless, screaming political posturing. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question. What local practices are you actively involved in, and what narrative are you living out in your own life? Are you just chasing external goods? Or are you actually cultivating true internal virtues alongside real people who know your name? It is time to stop screaming on the internet, step back, and start building a life of real meaning. I highly encourage you to take this diagnosis to heart, and I would love to hear your thoughts on MacIntyre's ideas in the comments below.
Please like and subscribe.